This afternoon, yes, I knew that the chamber was circular, Claire. I didn't realise it revolved as well. This afternoon we shall hear the outline budget from the Finance Secretary, but his room for manoeuvre is obviously limited by the nature of the funding of the Welsh Government. 92% of the money which the Welsh Government spends currently comes from the United Kingdom Government by block grant. So the success of the Welsh economy and the ability of the Welsh Government to spend depends crucially upon the health of the UK economy, which in turn depends crucially upon the economic policies of the government at Westminster. Does he think that the consequences for Wales of the kind of spending plans which Jeremy Corbyn outlined last week in Brighton would, in the long term, benefit the Welsh economy? They've been added up to about £312 billion. It must be one of the most expensive speeches in human history. That's £4.15 billion per minute, £69.3 million per second. Such a speech programme would actually bankrupt the UK economy, and that could be nothing less than disastrous for Wales.
It has never been cheaper to borrow. In 1945, a government came to power in the UK, presiding over a wrecked country and a wrecked economy, with far less money at its disposal. Yet it managed to create the National Health Service, managed to put industry back onto its feet. It managed to ensure that people's standard of living began to rise. It dealt with a country that had been destroyed because of the effects of war. If they can do it, then a Labour government can do it now. We've had 7 years of austerity and nothing has changed for the better. It's got worse and worse and worse. 7 wasted years. It's time for a change.
I don't want to debate economic history with the First Minister, but immediately after the war, we did, of course, have the Marshall Aid programme, and actually there was a very substantial reduction in the proportion of debt to GDP during the course of the Attlee government from 1945 to 1951. When Tony Blair came to office in 1997, the national debt stood at £359 billion, and in his first term of office, he actually reduced it further. In 2001, that was reduced to £317 billion. And then Gordon Brown turned on the spending taps, and we all know what happened with the financial crisis in 2008. The national debt now stands at nearly £2 trillion, and we're spending every single year £56 billion on debt interest alone. If the Welsh portion of that debt interest, which would be 1/20th, that's about £2 billion a year, was available to the Welsh Government to spend on the health service, social care, education, or whatever, Wales would be very much better off than it is now.
All governments have to borrow. There are very few governments that don't have to borrow, usually those that are oil-rich. The reality is you borrow to invest. And what we are seeing at the moment is a government that is bumping the British economy off the ground. We know that as far as injections of money are concerned, that's not happening. The economy is not being stimulated. Now, he doesn't want me to lecture him on economic history. I will. And recent economic history, which he will remember, because he seemed to suggest that Gordon Brown was responsible for the world financial crash in 2008. The reality is the crash was caused by irresponsible banks selling financial products to people who they knew full well would not be able to repay them. And then they bundled those debts and sold them onto other banks, infecting the entire system. That's what happened. We are still living with the consequences of that. It's quite clear to me, then, that the old ways of doing things cannot be followed in the future. We need, well, a Keynesian injection of cash into the economy in order to make sure that we create more employment, that we put more money in people's pockets and stimulate the economy in that way. Because it's quite clear that over the past 7 years, what's being done isn't working.
You would think from what the First Minister just said that there hadn't been a Labour government from 1997 to 2008 and the Chancellor of the Exchequer was not Gordon Brown in charge of banking regulation, whereas we know that he believed in a light-touch regulation of banking, so he was a contributor to the financial crisis which ultimately engulfed him. But Jim Callaghan knew what was right the financial crisis, because I'm sure the First Minister will remember very well in 1976 he appeared at a rather different kind of Labour Party conference and said, "We used to think you could spend your way out of recession and increase employment by boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists, and so far as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step." Jeremy Corbyn, if he ever did learn that lesson, seems to have forgotten it, and his role as a kind of moth-eaten Santa Claus dipping into a bottomless bag of presents to dish out to gullible children is not the way forward for any sensible or realistic political party which has any designs upon holding the highest offices in the land.
We have revealed to us this afternoon the UKIP strategy for dealing with appealing to young voters. You are all gullible children, is the way that they're going to be described in the future. So I can't see many of them voting UKIP in the future. In the 1970s, there were particular challenges with stagflation, as he should remember, because of the soaring price of oil as a result of the 1973 oil crisis. That knocked the usual economic cycle out of sync, and as a result we saw rising unemployment and rising inflation at the same time, meaning that the traditional way of injecting money into the economy to deal with high unemployment. I can give the Leader of the Opposition a lecture on economic history if he wants. He knows next to nothing about it. And so the circumstances of the 1970s are very, very different. But what I can say to him about 1976 is a statistic for him. 1976 was the time in history when Britain was most equal. Since then, the Tories have made it more and more and more unequal, and that's what a Labour government will change.